Hello everyone, Jacob here. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about this word here, whereas, and how it's used, to connect two sentences. We'll say a full sentence, subject, verb, object, whereas, and then another full sentence, subject, verb, object. And in Korean, this means 반면에. And just like in Korean, it's used to show the differences, between two things, to kind of compare two things. And there's actually a few ways to say 반면에 in English. I think whereas is probably the best, but there are other ways, and I will mention those in this lesson. So first, let's look at our first example. South Korea is rich. South Korea is a developed country, whereas North Korea is poor. Okay, there are actually many differences between South Korea and North Korea. South Korea is a democracy, whereas North Korea is a dictatorship. Okay, but I think the biggest difference is South Korea is rich, whereas North Korea is poor. So again, here I'm using this structure whereas, this word whereas, to connect two sentences and kind of show the differences between two things. In this case, South Korea and North Korea. So it's just a really useful structure that we use to compare two different things. And in Korean, this would mean 대한민국은 부자인 반면에 북한은 가난해요. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at our second example. Whereas Busan doesn't get too cold, Seoul is freezing in the winter. Okay, there are actually, again, many differences between Busan and Seoul, and there are many reasons that I kind of prefer living in Busan than Seoul. But the biggest reason is probably that, Busan doesn't get too cold, whereas Seoul is freezing. Okay, but here in this example, I'm actually putting whereas at the beginning of the sentence because I just wanted to show you that that's possible. You could put it in between the two sentences, kind of in the middle, like this, or you can change the order and put it at the beginning. That's fine too. So, whereas Busan doesn't get too cold, Seoul is freezing in the winter. And it's kind of the reason I never want to live in Seoul. I do not like freezing weather. Anyway, so like I said before, you don't have to use whereas in these sentences. There is another way to say 반면에. Instead of whereas, you could say while. Okay, so you could say South Korea is rich while North Korea is poor. While Busan doesn't get very cold, Seoul is freezing. Okay, so often we will say while instead of whereas to mean 반면에 in English. But to be honest, I recommend whereas, and I'll tell you why. In some situations, while sounds a bit weird. In fact, in this second sentence, it sounds okay, but it might be a little bit confusing because when I say while Busan doesn't get too cold, Seoul is freezing, some people might misunderstand me. Some people might think that I'm saying when Busan, isn't cold, Seoul is freezing. So when Seoul is really cold, Busan isn't cold, which is not true. Busan and Seoul both get cold at the same time. It's just that Busan doesn't get very cold, but Seoul gets really cold. So again, you have to kind of be careful when you're using while, because sometimes in certain sentences, even this one, it might sound a bit confusing. Alright, so just be careful about that. And honestly, when you're speaking, I really recommend whereas. I think this is the most natural, kind of the easiest to use, and just, I don't know, it won't confuse anyone. So, I think whereas is great. So let's move on to our last example, and I'm actually going to talk about the difference between whereas and while. So let's look at my sentence. We'll say whereas, and I'm going to put that in quotations, whereas always sounds fine. Whereas always sounds fine when you want to say 반면에. Whereas while sometimes sounds weird. Okay, this is actually kind of a complicated sentence, but it's basically saying what I just explained before, kind of the differences between whereas and while. So again, here I'm showing the differences between this word whereas and while by using this expression or this word or this structure whereas. So that's a bit confusing. If that example confuses you, don't worry about it. Just look at these, study these examples, which are much easier to understand. Alright, so that is pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about in this lesson, except there is one more way to say 밤연애 in English, which I'm sure a lot of people are aware of. You can use kind of just an expression. You could say on the one hand, subject, verb, object. And then you can make a second sentence saying on the other hand, subject, verb, object. Alright? But the important thing to remember is that when you're saying on the one hand, on the other hand, this is not a conjunction. You cannot connect two sentences with one of these expressions. You have to make kind of two separate sentences. So let's look at our examples, and I will change them using on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, South Korea is rich. On the other hand, North Korea is poor. Okay, here I'm making two separate sentences. On the one hand, Busan doesn't get too cold. On the other hand, Seoul is freezing. On the one hand, whereas always sounds fine. On the other hand, while sometimes sounds weird. Okay, so this is another common way to say 밤연애 in English. So you have whereas, you have while, and you have these kind of expressions here. Like I said before though, I still think whereas is the most common, the best, the easiest one to use when you're speaking, so I recommend whereas. Alright, I hope you understood the lesson, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.